Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the new album from Eminem, titled The Marshall Mathers LP 2. Now, if you know music in the past 15 years, you know Eminem. You probably own one of his albums, considering his classic album, the Marshall Mathers LP, has gone diamond in the States. He's become a fixture in American pop culture, and with several acclaimed albums under his belt, some could make the argument that he's got nothing left to prove. And you know, I don't think anybody has told Eminem that, because as of recent, his releases seem to have taken the form of an artist trying to recapture the spirit of something that he once had and now is slipping away. And he's never been able to find it quite in the same way. And this is speaking as an Eminem fan who will defend all of his albums. Yes, even Encore and even Relapse. A pair of albums that aren't nearly as bad as certain folks have made them out to be. Yes, Encore is incredibly uneven and contains some of the worst raps of Eminem's career, but it's also an album that does exactly what it was designed to do. A ritualistic endpoint for Eminem's career capped off by artistic suicide in the last track. And yet, unsurprisingly, the fans hated it and demanded the return of Slim Shady. And Eminem did just that 5 years later on Relapse, a tortured and punishingly bleak album where Eminem brought all the sick nastiness of Slim Shady to the forefront and said, "You wanted it, you got it." The mistakes he made with both of these albums, though, is that stylistic, artistic ugliness works best with a good core framework, and the haphazard rapping and accents damage that essential core and inevitably compromise those albums. Now, fortunately, Eminem did correct this with 2010's Recovery, his spiritual revival where he finally put to bed some of the demons that have been haunting him over the past several years, primarily his place in the modern hip-hop landscape, his drug overdose in 2007, his constant issues with women, and finally the death of his best friend Proof in 2006. However, a new problem began cropping up here and on his team up with Royce da 5'9" in the next year, on Hell the Sequel. The instrumentation always just felt a little bit too polished and slick for Eminem, and lacked some of that grimy edge and texture that made so much of his old material as compelling as it was. Furthermore, despite superb technical skills, Eminem's anger now felt kind of directionless, as he has solved the majority of his issues now, and the resulting albums just felt unfocused and too dour for their own good. The absolute nadir of this was Lighters, a momentum-killing turd of a song that didn't work for me in the slightest and epitomized both the worst symptoms of poor instrumentation, a bad guest star, and unfocused rage. And you know what? I gotta be honest here. When I heard about the Marshall Mathers LP 2, I was more than a little concerned that these problems that I described were going to get a lot worse. I mean, I love the Marshall Mathers LP. The album's a goddamn classic. So why besmirch it by making a record that's probably guaranteed not to be an appropriate follow-up aligned with the original on a thematic level? Yeah, that album's dark madness had a lot to say about Eminem's personal psychoses and his issues with fame, pop culture, women, and his audience. And I was willing to bet that Eminem, despite being a rapper of superb technical skill and prowess, would probably not return to this well of influences. And coupled with his list of guest stars and my own natural skepticism, I was dreading this album's release and I was expecting the worst. Did I get it? Well, no, not really. In fact, this Eminem album was certainly an interesting endeavor, to be sure, and one that, you know what, I think I should let it really sink in for the next couple of weeks to just truly take in the album. So, you know what, I'll come back with the review then. Okay, I'm just messing with you all here, so let me just give you the fast and dirty with this album. Is the Marshall Mathers LP 2 good? Yes, it's good. Is it great? Yeah, it's actually really good. Is it better than the Marshall Mathers LP? No. Is it one of the best albums of the year? Well, no. Look, it's a very strong album, and it's one that surprised me a lot in a good way. It's easily Eminem's best album in over a decade, but it's far from perfect, and it's hampered by a number of very real problems that will seriously put off a lot of critics and a lot of listeners. Still, if you're a fan of hip-hop and rap, and especially of Eminem, you're probably going to love this album regardless, and it does get a recommendation from me. Just a qualified one. I will say this though, if you're going into this album without having listened to Eminem's material for a while, you'll definitely want to go back through the discography, including the mixtapes, before tackling this record, because the number of callbacks to previous albums all throughout his career, it's a little staggering, to be honest. Now, let's address the big problems first, the ones that really hurt this album. most of which actually aren't linked to Eminem himself as a rapper at all. No, this is tied into the instrumentation and the production, which really is a mixed bag. Look, some songs harken back to the old school grime of the Marshall Mathers LP, some are decidedly more in the bombastic vein of Recovery, and others go in a completely offbeat direction I don't think anybody could have expected. Dude, somewhat decidedly mixed results. This is mostly an issue in the synth melody lines. There are points where it just feels decidedly too polished and slick, which leads to some of the great moments of texture that used to be the hallmark of Eminem's beast, that lurking undersense that something wasn't quite right. It was just kind of off kilter. What I suspect more critics will take issue with are the occasional usage of heavier instrumentation, mostly electric guitars and pounding cacophonous drums that are very reminiscent of early Beastie Boys, as the lead-off single Berserk proved. Overall, it leads to a much lighter tone on the album, that it's a defiant contrast to the pitch darkness of the Marshall Mathers LP, or even the dour seriousness of Recovery, and I can tell that some people will not take the lighter tone very well. Hell, So Far and Love Game are borderline comedy songs, and while I can appreciate and like the lighter tone, most critics are going to find them silly as hell, because they kind of are. What's more striking is that songs like So Far and the bonus track Desperation have a distinctly country twang to them. Well, I didn't mind it, but then again, I'm the only country music critic on YouTube, and I can guarantee that these songs will largely be castigated by the fan base. And then you have Love Game, which samples the 1965 classic Game of Love by Wayne Fontana and the Mindbenders. And sure, I thought it was a nifty choice and has a ton of really nifty personality and has a really rollicking edge. But you can bet most angry white boys or critics aren't gonna love that particular choice. But there is something of a downside of moving in a heavier direction, and that is that a certain amount of subtlety is lost, and the songs can lose some of their edge in favor of a broad wallop that doesn't always quite match Eminem's immaculate wordplay. And unfortunately, on that note, the guest stars aren't particularly strong either, at least in comparison with the main performer. I don't understand Eminem's obsession with female singers on his choruses, but as with Recovery, it's rare that they work particularly well together, and it can make some of the songs feel kind of overblown. I mean, Skylar Grey is serviceable enough, although somebody really needs to lend that girl some personality, and Rihanna is better on The Monster than she's been in months, but Sia doesn't really impress me on her bonus track, and Liz Rodriguez proves shockingly anonymous on Survival. Now, I think the biggest disappointment here, it comes from Nate Ruess of Fun. He's already an awkward fit for an Eminem song, and while his chorus, well, it's not bad, whose bright idea was it to slather his vocals in autotune that's just distracting? And as for the rappers on the S album, the only one that shows up is Kendrick Lamar on Love Game, and while it's not the worst verse he's ever dropped, it's definitely far from his best, and compared to his verse that he did on Pusha T's Nostalgia earlier this year, it doesn't work as well as it should. So okay, what about Eminem himself? Well, as I've said in the past, the man is a master with flow and wordplay, and the number of punchlines and insane references on multiple layers he crams into his songs are enough to make anybody's head spin. Although I will say it got quite annoying when the music dropped out more than one time in a song on a punchline. I mean, you lose some of the impact when you do it. But I do have one big issue with Eminem here, and that's the singing. And look, while he's more on tune than he used to be, it's distracting as all hell, and it gets more than a little embarrassing on Stronger Than I Was, which seems to be a much less subtle take on Encore's Love You More from the bonus disc, with an R&B twist, and the sad fact is he seems like he's playing it almost entirely straight. And look, you said on Haley's song that you can't sing, and you know that you can rap your hooks, so why on earth did you include this song? It's easily the worst song on the record, and the sad fact is it actually had some pretty decent instrumentation that I kinda liked. But okay, let's look at the larger picture here. I said back in my Pusha T review that technical rapping proficiency and skill and talent is my baseline for good rap, and with the content being which what would put it above and beyond in my good books. And much to my pleasant surprise, Eminem delivers here far more than I actually expected he would. And he actually does manage to follow up on some of the themes he brought through on the Marshall Mathers LP, and actually some of the narrative through line from that album. And that was a big hit for me. I'm not gonna spoil all the little moments, including one on the opening track, Bad Guy, that will hit you like a sack of bricks when you pick up on it, but I will say that legitimate targets for Eminem's anger do actually materialize, mostly courtesy of his absentee father, bullies that made his life hell in high school, well, not really high school, school in general, and yes, women in perpetually bad relationships that always seem to materialize on Eminem albums. And yes, I'd be be lying by omission if I didn't say that the latter didn't reek of some sort of misogyny, although it's so broadly over the top that it's impossible to take seriously, although Eminem does toe the line between reality and fiction with his intensity, and you can bet that there's a whole slew of guys that are unfortunately going to take it all at face value. Although, the funny thing is that this album is probably Eminem's least controversial album to date. There aren't that many of the twisted horrorcore fantasies that were so big on the Marshall Mathers LP, and the elements of gay bashing are significantly cranked back and confined to the Slim Shady persona. Hell, after years of diss tracks, he includes Headlights, which is basically a long-form reconciliation track directed at his mother. Not so much an apology, but a change of heart I don't think anybody could have seen coming. And much to my pleasant surprise, the social commentary comes back in a big way, but now with a really interesting twist. While Slim Shady in the past took aim at the vapidness of pop culture in the late 90s, now he's living in a world shaped by his music, and there are significant segments of the tracks taking on the subtext of his previous works and turning it into straight up text. That Slim Shady is not a role model, never was, and that it's perversely sickening how many people empathize and idolize that character. That's always been the strength of Eminem's best work, intelligently framing himself as the villain and as the asshole that nobody should look up to, way too open about his personal emotions and completely devoid of a filter. And really, the tracks that focus in on Eminem's reflexive analysis of his own fame are some of the best on the album because he manages to bring the appropriate context. Everything that Reflector got wrong for Arcade Fire, Eminem gets right here with the Marshall Mathers LP 2. And some of these tracks like Bad Guy, Asshole, Rap God, Brainless, especially Evil Twin, and even The Monster are great critiques of the perverse effects of his own success. Wicked Ways, even on the bonus disc, is worthy of some analysis as that he drops the fact that he actually might have Asperger's syndrome. Now, granted, it's a self-diagnosis, but considering his obsessiveness, his introversion and desire to just be left alone, his crippling social awkwardness outside of music, and his complete openness regardless of consequence, among other factors, you know what, I'm inclined to buy it. What's more impressive is that he never uses it as an excuse for his bad behavior. It's just something that he's had to deal with, and without proper treatment, and I kind of respect that. Now, some of you might argue that Evil Twin is a direct refutation of the separation between Slim Shady and Eminem, and basically the gigantic excuse that Eminem has been making throughout his career that, no, it's Slim Shady saying it, not Eminem. But considering the final lines, it kind of refutes that. But I'd argue the song still works because the underlying message is still here. Even if there is no separation between the terrible things Slim Shady said, and they were a manifestation of real, genuine thoughts that Eminem had, he has always stressed that nobody should have bought into it because of his framing as Slim Shady's a contemptible human being. It was the subtext behind Relapse, and now he's finally made it into the main text of this entire album. So, one must ask the question, does Eminem have a solution to the culture he's been instrumental in crafting? Well, outside of pitch black nihilism, not really. Yet, fortunately, Eminem makes the common correction that most nihilistic artwork doesn't make and manages to actually make it interesting. If he has any goals on this album, however, it's these. He wants to set the record straight regarding Slim Shady and how anybody who bought into the surface messages of that particular music never really got the point, and he also wants to leave behind some inspiration for kids growing up just like him on tracks like Legacy. On multiple songs, he articulates the choices he made to harness his talent early on, and how it's brought him success that he could have never dreamed and has a hard time dealing with, playing with it with the same self-deprecating comedy that he's always had, particularly on the riotously hilarious So Far, which is one of my favorite tracks on the album. From a larger thematic viewpoint, this is an album definitely designed to look backwards on the past, from the intimate view within Eminem's personal life and psyche, to the music that made him a legend, to the cultural impact he's had at large, good and bad. And yet the intelligent thing he does with the framing is that he doesn't really take a stand on where he's actually taken. It's not something that's happened, it's really other people who have responded to it and shaped that particular culture. If anything, he makes lines in reference to the Joker that he's really achieved the anarchistic goals that the Joker wished he could have. And now some might argue that this album takes him to task for some of the terrible things he's said and done, especially on the opening track Bad Guy, but really it's just making explicit everything Eminem has said between the lines on previous albums. And while there is a certain lack of subtlety to that, Eminem hammers the basic message home so effectively that really it almost doesn't matter. Just like George Carlin said, he's welcoming everybody to the freak show on this album. And frankly, Eminem has acknowledged that he's long been a part of it. So, In the end, the Marshall Mathers LP2 is a great album. A flawed album, to be sure, but a great one all the same. If you're a hardcore fan of Eminem, you'll definitely see it as a return to form, and there's definitely enough little shifts in direction that do make it refreshing. Now, there are plenty of critics who will deride some of the album's unabashed sincerity and occasional bad jokes as corny. And well, look, they aren't wrong here, but you know what? It didn't bother me as much. I can accept the corny jokes, and I like the lighter tone. It better fits. Now, I was more annoyed by the singing, the occasional lackluster guest star, and the frustrating lack of texture and instrumental prowess on some of the tracks. But even with that in mind, the flow and wordplay are some of the best you will find in hip-hop and rap today, and it's such a welcome sight to have Eminem have something fresh and interesting to say. This album is going to get an 8 out of 10 from me, and a solid recommendation. Guess who's back, folks? Shady's back. Tell your friends and get this album. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's any other albums coming out that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm more than ears. Until then, see you next time.